And good morning from your local election headquarters in Little Rock. I am Mitch McCoy. Good morning to you. It is 11:26 on the clock right now. And boy, we are in for what could be a very interesting couple of months in the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. As we get ready and we count down to Election Day. Want to point out that we are just several hours away from the first presidential debate. It is at 8 o'clock Eastern time. You can watch it right here on KARK4. And of course, we'll have live coverage leading up to the presidential debate all day long on all of our digital platforms. But I want to get to what really is going to be the most interesting conversation that is going to be happening leading up to Election Day and even post-election. And it's what happens after all of the votes are tallied up and everything is counted. Could there be lawsuits? We've heard the president say that about the transition of power. Of course, you've seen that on all of your news stations as well. And I want to join in and welcome in the brain, the mastermind behind not only political science, but the Constitution. And it is Dr. Christopher Williams. He is a professor at UA Little Rock, assistant professor of political science. Thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thanks for having me, Mitch.
Okay, so I can only imagine the conversations happening in your classrooms right now.
If we were in classrooms, yes.
Or online, virtually.
Yeah, I mean, the conversations we're having are they are somewhat confused because we're not really exactly sure what is going to happen or transpire after this election, and there is a lot to think about. Something that we haven't really had to do much in the United States, thinking about in the United States before.
So what do you see being the most watched issue here as we get countdown to the election and then after the election, depending on what happens? We've heard the president allude to not a peaceful transition of power. Then he kind of went back on that and said that it would be friendly, depending on how the ballots are casted. But what do you see being that focal point? What are people going to be watching here in Washington, D.C.?
Well, I do think that there are a couple of things going on here. Obviously, there are the issues that the public is concerned about and the issues the public will be voting on, right? We have everything from the COVID pandemic to the Supreme Court nomination to the president's taxes, which were just disclosed, I believe, 2 days ago. That's all normal policy, right? This is normal things that the public thinks about with regard to who they want to vote for, right? Things start to get abnormal, though, when we start thinking about how this election could transpire. Specifically, we've never had a president, at least not in modern times, refuse to agree that he will honor the outcome of the election, right? And this is highly unusual for the United States. Unfortunately, it's not that unusual throughout the world, where we do see in places like Venezuela, for example, leaders refusing to accept that the outcome of the election is legitimate. What we then expect to see, again, this is all probabilistically speaking, is a high likelihood that the president will challenge any outcome in court. And then there are questions as to whether or not the court will take the case, right? Because it would most likely begin in the Supreme Court. It wouldn't go through the system. And so then we'd have questions about that. After that, what we would end up having is essentially any number of possible scenarios if the president decided to challenge and the court decided to take the case and decide the case.
What would happen there? I mean, if let's say we go down to Election Day and, or excuse me, Inauguration Day, right? So we're talking January 2021 at this point. The votes, they've been counted. Let's say a lawsuit is filed contesting the election, and it doesn't really matter if it's President Trump or Democratic nominee Joe Biden that filed the lawsuit. I think the scenario both stands both ways. What would happen if, let's say, one of those candidates or the candidates filed a lawsuit?
Okay, well, there are lots of things that could happen here. First of all, I believe it is on January 6th, the electors had the House of Representatives and the Senate need to certify the election, right? So essentially, Inauguration Day, we don't even get to that point yet. I believe it's mid-December, the electors come together, and those are the electors of the Electoral College from each state. And they come together and they cast their ballots, okay? Once that's done, that is sent to the House of Representatives and the Senate, rather, not the Supreme Court, I'm sorry, the House of Representatives and the Senate, and the House of Representatives and the Senate in a joint session certify the election. Members of the House of Representatives or members of the Senate can contest certain electors, right? But generally speaking, they certify what the Electoral College sends them. Now, if we get to the point where the electors are set to meet and we still don't have a decision by a Supreme Court, how this plays out is really difficult, right? Because it all turns on whether or not electors have been certified by the states, right? The Secretary of State of each of the states. And even more than that, state legislatures have some role in certifying elections as well. So all of that is the mechanics of this, and how that plays out is not exactly clear. What it appears is if states don't have certified electors by the mid-December mark, where they have to the electors have to cast their ballot, what we could end up with is a state's electors, that is their electoral votes, not being counted.
Very interesting. So the easy word for all of this is it's complex.
Extremely complex, yes.
So, okay, let's run through a couple. And by the way, I want to mention that we are streaming live on krk.com, fox16.com, and of course on all of our social media platforms. So if there are any folks out there that have a question for Dr. Williams, again, UA Little Rock professor, assistant professor of political science here in Little Rock, feel free, leave your question in the comments on Facebook Live, and we'll certainly try and get to your question. So let's run through a scenario. Let's say we have Joe Biden takes the election in November. Let's say the White House, President Trump, they're contesting it. At that point, what happens? I mean, Joe Biden is gonna would he be in office come January 20?
Well, okay. This is actually an interesting aspect of this. If we don't have anyone receiving 270 electoral votes by the time the House and the Senate have to certify this, the decision on who is president rests with the House of Representatives. Right? We are required by law that a president receive a majority of the electoral votes cast, and that's 270. So if no candidate gets there, right, the House of Representatives decides who the next president is. The interesting aspect of that is the Democrats control the House of Representatives. However, the way it's decided on a presidential race is not by a vote, a person-by-person vote. Each state delegation gets to decide who their state throws their vote behind. So essentially, each state gets a vote. And the delegation to the House of Representatives from each of those states then gets to decide who they want their state's one vote to go to. And the interesting aspect is, even though the Democrats control the House of Representatives, the Republicans control more states than the Democrats do. And this is partly because states like California and New York and Illinois have so many Democratic Representatives. They can control the House of Representatives, but a majority of the states are controlled by Republicans, which means if it got to a point where no one candidate had 270 or more electoral votes, the House of Representatives would most likely choose a Republican to take that position. It could be Donald Trump. It could be anybody else.
So it's very possible, if it gets to this point, that the House, more than likely, right, or long story short, it would be decided that President Trump would stay in office.
That is more than likely, yes. I wouldn't say it's definitive because nothing is definitive in the future. We're all talking about probabilities here, but it seems like that would be a highly likely scenario.
And I cut you off. Sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. No, you can go ahead.
So again, I want to remind folks that we are on Facebook Live this morning. We're on KRK.com, Fox16.com, having really a conversation on a million different scenarios, because I'm sure that as one might guess, there are so many different ways this could go, and it could just be a flat out win on, whatever side. So what are historians watching during all of this? What are folks like you who are responsible for teaching people and everyone, what are you guys watching so that way you can have these conversations with students, 10, 15, 20 years down the road?
Well, Mitch, I'm going to be completely honest. First of all, I'm not a historian. I'm a political scientist, and there's a definitive difference. So I can't speak for what historians are watching, but I know what a lot of political scientists are watching and worried about specifically, and that's the extra legal activities that might occur from a court intervention, or really an election that might seem illegitimate. Because I think the big concern here is, let's say Joe Biden wins the election, Donald Trump challenges it in court, and the Supreme Court decides to set aside the election as stands and find some way to declare that Donald Trump actually won. What this is going to absolutely lead to is violence, right? And this is a big concern, because as soon as an election feels illegitimate, we end up seeing, and this is based on what we see in other countries throughout the world, those who feel like an election may have been taken from them illegitimately have no other recourse to have their voice heard. So what it may lead to is, say violence beginning on the left, which is then responded to by violence on the right, and we end up with civil unrest, would be the nice way to put it. Worst case scenario would be outright civil war.
Has this ever happened before in American history?
I'd say 1860 probably. What we ended up seeing was a candidate won, Abraham Lincoln, and a large portion of the states decided that they didn't like the outcome of the election, decided that it was illegitimate, and seceded from the Union. And that did, in fact, actually result in civil war. Right?
Very interesting.
Yeah, so it's not completely out of the realm of possibility. And there's a lot of research out there that shows presidential political systems, which we are one of, right? There are multiple different types of democracy out there, different ways to set up the institutions. We use a presidential system, as we all know. And there's a lot of research that shows presidential systems are more prone towards civil war than non-presidential systems. We're more prone to violence. The United States has absolutely is not as peaceful as we've thought it, as we tend to think it is, right? We've seen obviously the original Civil War, 1860 to 1865, that absolutely threatened the existence of the Union, right? That is the United States as a country. But we saw in the 1960s, we also saw a lot of violence, particularly when John Kennedy was elected. There was substantial violence in many parts of the United States, partly due to the fact that many people were concerned about a Catholic being elected president, and there was concern about how John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson would address the civil rights issues in the United States. And we saw skirmishes, and we did see violence. There was violence, particularly in the South during this time period, but also the North was not immune. So we have seen this happen in the United States. I think one of the other things is if, for example, this is not to say that the left is absolutely going to create the violence. If, say, Joe Biden wins and the court doesn't set aside the election, it's very possible that Donald Trump might try to encourage his supporters to also become violent. That is a possibility as well. So it's possible on both sides of the spectrum that this results in violence because of a perceived illegitimacy of the election.
Very interesting. And I want to remind folks that we are having this conversation, and it's a conversation. That's all it is. We're just talking about different scenarios come Election Day, November, and then ultimately come, January 6th when everything has to be certified, and then leading up to Inauguration Day here in the United States. It is 11:42. Good morning to you. I'm Mitch McCoy. We are having this conversation right here on Facebook Live this morning and KRK.com, Fox16.com. We are watching your comments come in. If you have a question, feel free to send them in. We will certainly try and get to them here in our live conversation this morning with UA Little Rock, Assistant Professor of Political Science, Dr. Christopher Williams. Real quick, how do you think this conversation, do you think this will be a conversation tonight during the first presidential debate?
Oh, well, that's a really great question, Mitch. There's a lot to talk about in this debate tonight. Everything from a global pandemic that the United States has been suffering from, right? Not just the entire world, but and 200,000 dead people. That's going to come up, right? I believe that's actually Chris Wallace has said that was, I think, the second thing that they're talking about. Donald Trump's taxes are going to come up. I have no doubt about that because it's something that the Biden campaign wants to talk about, right? A number of things are going to come up. I'm guessing if I were running the Biden campaign, I would absolutely bring this up. I would probably challenge Donald Trump to agree to a peaceful transition of power on stage. Whether or not that actually happens, that's up to the Biden campaign, right?
What do you think? So if you're in the Biden war room right now, you're probably saying, "Hey, you have to do this." What do you think those conversations are like right now in Trump's war room? Do you think his experts are saying, "Hey, you have to agree to this"?
I don't know. The Trump administration is particularly unusual in American history, right? Because it is so dominated by the candidate himself, right? And I'm not entirely sure that the people around him are able to tell him what they think he should do, let alone actually control what he does. I don't believe that that there's much likelihood of him agreeing to a peaceful transition of power, mainly because he's already been asked once and he wouldn't commit. Right? Asking him again most likely will not influence that decision whatsoever. So I don't know what would actually be happening in the Trump campaign, simply because it's such a highly unusual campaign. The Biden campaign appears to be run very traditionally, right? The way that we've run campaigns in the United States since the 1940s, right? In the modern history of the presidency. The Trump campaign is different, so I would have a real hard time even beginning to understand what might be going on inside the war room of the Trump campaign.
Something kind of interesting as we continue to monitor some of the Facebook comments here. Again, if you have any questions, I'm certainly looking out for them, and feel free to pass them on, and I can relay them to our political science expert here this morning. So I thought this was interesting watching the Today Show this morning, and they said that what could be happening in terms of the Joe Biden camp is that they are closely watching President Trump's tweets, saying that they might be able to get an idea on possible attacks and things like that against the Democratic nominee through his Twitter account first.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense, right? The president has shown himself to be willing to share his thoughts pretty openly, probably more so than any other president ever, via social media. So, yeah, I think there probably are people who are watching this within the Biden campaign. Um, from what I've seen from the Biden campaign, however, it appears that it's a very well run campaign, right? The people are in charge have stuck to electoral strategy pretty strongly. And what this often entails is being unwilling to engage with any name calling or mudslinging or things like that, but rather sticking to the issues. And that appears to be what the Biden campaign um, is really focused on.
Watching some of the Facebook comments come in this morning right here on KRK.com, Fox16.com, and to check some of those out, it looks like a lot of course, whenever you get on Facebook, you're looking at all of the Biden supporters, you're looking at the Trump supporters, everybody coming together, having their own dialogue on social media. That certainly seems to be the case right now. And a lot of people are talking about the debate that's coming up tonight, and also talking about how they think that their candidate that they are going to be voting for here come November, or maybe they've already done it through early voting, is going to win. So a lot of confidence coming in on both the left and on the right sides.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, the actual outcome of this election, uh, you know, I think part of the reason why you have confidence on both sides is because 2016 was such a shock, right? And nobody in the public expected the outcome of this election.